Saving the Appearances, A Study in Idolatry by Owen Barfield. Chapter 4, Participation. In the last few decades, this whole question of the figurative makeup of collective representations and the theoretical confusion between what I have called figuration and what I have called alpha thinking has been implicitly raised by certain anthropologists. Putting it in a nutshell, they have suggested, by the whole manner of their approach to the workings of the primitive mind, the question: can there be such a thing as they thought they saw? Of course, two people can make the same momentary mistake about the identity of an imperfectly seen object. But, as we saw in Chapter 2, the generally accepted criterion of the difference between I thought I saw and I found it was is that the former is a private, the latter is a collective representation. How then if they are a whole tribe or population? If the mistake is not a momentary but a permanent one? If it is passed down for centuries from generation to generation? If in fact it is never followed by a they found it was? The difficulty is that then the mistake is itself a collective representation. And yet for ourselves, as we saw, it is precisely the collectivity of our representations which is the accepted test of their reality. It is this which convinces us that they are not mistakes or hallucinations. Why not then also for them, the primitive tribe? But this is to go too fast. The earlier anthropologists assume as a matter of course that the primitive peoples who still survive in various parts of the earth perceive and think in the same way as we do, but that they think incorrectly. The assumption which underlies their whole approach to the subject is effectively epitomized in two sentences from Tyler's Primitive Culture, first published in 1871. Quote, "It was no spontaneous fancy, but the reasonable inference that effects are due to causes, which led the rude men of olden days to people with such ethereal phantoms their own houses and haunts in the vast earth and sky beyond. Spirits are personified causes." End quote. This theory of an inferring followed by a peopling, which is usually called animism, but which Durkheim prefers to call naturism, is moreover, according to Lévi-Bruhl, especially typical of the English school of anthropology, and he attributes this, rightly or wrongly, to the influence of Herbert Spencer, who assumes so readily that all things evolve from simple to complex. Be that as it may, the theory is attacked by 20th century anthropologists to whom I have referred. They deny the inferring and question the peopling. Lévi-Bruhl himself, for instance, insists, in the light of the evidence, that to ask how the primitive mind would explain this or that natural phenomenon is a wrongly formulated question. The explanation is implied in the collective representations themselves. When we find a primitive mind incapable of grasping what is to us the self-evident law of contradiction, it is absurd to imagine such a mind thinking in terms of cause and effect, and of inference from one to the other. Rather, we are in contact with a different kind of thinking and a different kind of perceiving altogether. Lévi-Bruhl describes this pre-logical mentality, which he says is, quote, essentially synthetic. By this I mean that the syntheses which compose it do not imply previous analyses of which the result has been registered in definite concepts, as is the case with those in which logical thought operates. In other words, the connecting links of the representations are given, as a rule, in the representations themselves. End quote. This is also found to be a more satisfactory and convincing approach to the phenomenon of totemism, which involves the most inexplicable and, to us, nonsensical identifications and distinctions. To make no class distinction between the sun and a white cockatoo, but to feel instantly and sharply a world of difference between both of these natural phenomena and a black cockatoo is, it is felt, a state of mind at which it would be difficult to arrive by inference. The elements which the totem-conscious mind selects out of the whole representation for attention are often very, very different from those which we select. Often, for instance, it is not much interested in the distinction between animate and inanimate, including artificial, objects. Quote, "Almost everything that we see therein, for example, in a being or object or natural phenomenon, escapes their attention or is a matter of indifference to them. On the other hand, they see many things of which we are unconscious." End quote. This leads Lévi-Bruhl to the conclusion that primitives see with eyes like ours, but they do not perceive with the same minds. And he adds, quote, It is not correct to maintain, as is frequently done, that primitives associate occult powers, magic properties, a kind of soul or vital principle with all the objects which affect their senses or strike their imagination, and that their perceptions are supercharged with animistic beliefs. It is not a question of association. The mystic properties with which things are imbued form an integral part of the whole idea to the primitive who views them as a synthetic whole. It is at a later stage of social evolution that what we call a natural phenomenon tends to become the sole content of the perception to the exclusion of other elements, which then assume the aspect of beliefs, and finally appear superstitions. But as long as this dissociation does not take place, perception remains an undifferentiated whole." End quote. It may be questioned whether the epithet mystic, as it is used here, and in the expression participation mystique, which is especially associated with the name of Levi Bruhl, adds effectively to his meaning. Elsewhere he has defined the precise significance which he intends by it, and I shall revert to this shortly. What is important is the concept of participation. The principal reason which Levi Bruhl, Durkheim, and others assign for the fact that primitives do not perceive with the same minds as ours is that in the act of perception they are not detached, as we are, from the representations. For us, the only connection of which we are conscious is the external one through the senses. Not so for them. Thus Levi Bruhl, quote, "The collective representations and interconnections which constitute such a primitive mentality are governed by the law of participation, and insofar they take but little account of the law of contradiction." End quote. He speaks of, quote, "a veritable symbiosis between the totemic group and its totem," end quote, and tells us that, if we seek to penetrate their mental processes, we must understand the same by virtue, not the law of identity, but the law of participation. Durkheim seeks to carry much further the bearing of anthropological inquiry on the origin and evolution of abstract thought. He affirms, for instance, that the identification of persons and individual phenomena with totems violates the principle of contradiction only as predication does in our own thinking. The root or predecessor of predication is to be found in the use of totemic emblems by clans to express and communicate collective representations. We shall see that this same expression and communication are today the function of language. Participation begins by being an activity and essentially a communal or social activity. It takes place in rites and initiation ceremonies, resulting in, quote, "collective mental states of extreme emotional intensity, in which representation is as yet undifferentiated from the movements and actions which make the communion towards which it tends a reality to the group. Their participation in it is so effectively lived that it is not yet properly imagined." End quote. This stage is not only pre-logical, but also pre-mythical. It is anterior to collective representations themselves, as I have been using the term. Thus, the first development Durkheim traces is from symbiosis or active participation, where the individual feels he is the totem, to collective representations of the totemic type, where the individual feels that his ancestors were the totem and that he will be when he dies, etc. From this symbolic apprehension, he then arrives at the duality, with which we are more familiar, of ideas on the one hand and numinous religion on the other. This extrasensory participation of the percipient in the representation involves a similar link between the representations themselves and, of course, between one percipient and another. Mana, or Wakin, which we can only translate by abstract terms like totemic principle, life principle, or, since it is present also in inanimate objects, being, is anterior to the individuality of persons and objects. These, says Durkheim, are rather apprehended by the very primitive as stopping places of mana. It is, incidentally, here that he finds the prototype of the idea of force, which played such a prominent part in the physical science of the 19th century. And in emphasizing the religious origin of this idea, he points out, rather appositely, that Kant regarded the notion of force as a superstition, which was destined to disappear from science, as indeed it has shown marked signs of doing since Durkheim's book was published. I hope I have not misrepresented either of the two anthropologists from whom I have quoted rather freely. The more so, as I cannot pause to consider the adverse criticism which Levi Bruhl in particular has aroused. I doubt if it was his case that all primitives invariably thought in the pre-logical way. It is certainly not mine. If I have drawn heavily on these two writers, I have done so by the way of illustration rather than argument. It is not very difficult to see what they mean, and, by seeing what they mean, the reader may possibly be helped to see what I mean. Collective representations do not imply a collective unity distinct from the individuals comprising the social group. On the other hand, their existence does not derive from the individual. In these two respects, they may be compared to language. Like the words of a language, they are common to members of a given social group and are transmitted from one generation to another, developing and changing only gradually in the process. Moreover, it is impossible to draw a very precise line between representations and beliefs about representations, or, in the terms that I've been using, between figuration and alpha thinking. All collective representations involve figuration, and therefore, if figuration is a kind of thinking, involve thoughts. But in addition to this, nearly all of them involve elements which are actually apprehended as thought, or imagined, rather than as perceived. It was presumably this which persuaded Lévi-Brühl to add the word mystic to his participation. He uses it, he says, in the strictly defined sense in which mystic implies belief in forces and influences and actions, which, though imperceptible to sense, are nevertheless real. When I see a stone fall to the ground, do I believe that it is drawn by the force or the law of gravity? When I use the telephone, do I believe that my correspondent's voice is recorded and reproduced by an invisible called electricity? Or are both these thoughts immediately experienced in my representation? Or is one so and not the other? The exact point at which a piece of alpha thinking has slipped into and become an integral part of the representation is hard to determine and may clearly differ somewhat between individuals of the same social group and for the same individual at different times. It is continually happening while we are growing up, especially while we are learning to speak. I say I hear a thrush singing outside my window, but do I? He is invisible, and it might perhaps be a blackbird. I have begun the business of thinking and believing already. The same thing happens to a lifelong birdwatcher. He does no thinking at all. He recognizes. He hears a thrush singing. For him, alpha thinking has become figuration. To sum up what has been said in this chapter, anthropology began by assuming as a matter of course that primitive peoples perceive the same phenomena as we do, and on that assumption, investigated their beliefs about these phenomena. Now, however, some anthropologists have begun to point out that the difference between the primitive outlook and ours begins at an earlier stage. It is not only a different alpha thinking, but a different figuration, with which we have to do, and therefore the phenomena are treated as collective representations produced by that different figuration. It is further maintained by some of them that the most striking difference between primitive figuration and ours is that the primitive involves participation. That is, an awareness which we no longer have, of an extrasensory link between the percipient and the representations. This involves not only that we think differently, but that the phenomena, collective representations, themselves are different. The first 3 chapters were devoted to reminding the reader that we do, in fact, still participate in the phenomena, though for the most part we do so unconsciously. We can only remind ourselves of that participation by beta thinking, and we forget it again as soon as we leave off. This is the fundamental difference not only between their thinking and ours, but also between their phenomena and ours. It remains to consider how ours, which are genetically the latter, have come to pass.